Hello everyone, today we talk about the Roman decares or decares, whether you want to put more emphasis on the Latin or the Hellenic terminology. Telling the truth, today we will look a bit at the prehistory of the decares as far as the Macedonians had first developed such monsters of the sea. You know that the decares simply stems etymologically from the concept that the word 10 meant per section, oaring the ship, more of the technicalities later. When you look at even just the overall size of these ships, yes, they're bigger compared to the other ones, but let's say compared to modern technological scalar development, these are not like enormous structures that you can't quite properly even maneuver at the point, even though in battle, as we will see now, they did have problems as far as the smaller sort of ship's maneuverability was involved. As always in warfare, like the bigger the better. If you have the means to handle that, right? People often say that the fact that things cost a lot as opposed to, say, the actual military performance for which they are created there. And of course, there is a bit of Hellenistic giantism that is, however, functional. Like we tend to see also the Greeks from their literature as a bit overly fixating with ideas, with technology, etc. But of course, the actual diadochoi, commanders, generals, admirals, etc., had a pretty consistent idea of what, sort of the consistency of their power, to the point of course, having their own fleets revolving around some major flagships that represented the core, the bulk of the fleet, at least in a general sense. This is important in naval combat also when there is some broader complexity. When fleets are actually larger, you need a flagship, even just like on land warfare. If you read the statutes of the Templars, very different time, if anything, not much place either. You realize that the visibility, especially of the rally point and or where the commander stands, as he can also retreat at a point from the battle, is crucial at so many moral levels. We haven't talked a lot about Hellenistic naval warfare. When you look at the Roman one, you realize that basically the Italics had made of the Mediterranean a Roman lake, and as such, they also had a major naval capacity through which they literally pacified the Mediterranean. You know that for centuries, basically, piracy wasn't practically there, or at least it was virtually irrelevant. But if you look at naval warfare in general, the annals of military history, there aren't these many naval battles. We have explained, of course, in other videos how and why naval forces, especially until essentially the later modern era, weren't this enormously important military instrument other than one allowing the land armies to be properly supplied, right? So, of course, in this sense, naval warfare was quite important, and you would have big naval battles. But at the same time, the same preeminence of terrestrial warfare, and very often the fact that putting together a fleet in the first place, we were looking at that the other day in the Battle of Pharsalus. We were reading among the sources how, for example, Pompey had so many ships, and he didn't use them to blockade the same Greece or the contacts with Italy before. We were talking Dyrrhachion, Pharsalus, about which I made a battle, in fact, just the other day. And so there are so many different situations you can look at, except for Rome, in this majorly unitary sense, where the Res Publica controlled, again, the entire Mediterranean. As a Roman lake, you have very big navies. Think about Cape Misenum, Ravenna, that there was probably a sea of the imperial fleet, and with always an updated strategical capacity with major reach all across the Mediterranean and beyond even. We talked about, if anything, later Roman warfare, for example, in the northern waters, right, and not only. But given the same Roman unity, there was basically very few occasions, in fact, mostly during the civil wars, where you see major naval engagements. This is not a video where we discuss, in fact, the greater sort of politics or strategy of this, or nor the costs as a whole. I made multiple videos on some sort of comparative idea, for example, looking at Athenian thalassocracy versus the US Navy today in terms of costs, right, for global strategic projection. That also, in fact, in that kind of Hellenic oikoumene was comparable. And it turns out that the costs were strikingly similar in terms of GDP, so to say. You can check that video out if you're interested. In any case, it's a coincidence in part, but by scale, it's not, right? In equally, with Rome, you realize Romans are incredibly pragmatic, right? They're very concrete. They see the military instrument with a lucidity that hardly any other people in history was able to achieve. And their use of the navy was limited. Even though they had literally beaten the Carthaginians at sea, they had proven to be superior in a broader civilizational, cultural, technical sense to any other opponent. At that level, essentially adapting the same Hellenistic military technology, for example, and in some cases also improving it, especially in the early imperial period, through some, let's say, the development of a same Hellenistic background. We'll talk about this too. If we look at this decary, there is some of it as well. However, it's only when you look at the details of these ships, their meaning, that you can appreciate how relevant these actually were and how the Romans would make a proper use of this. Now, Pliny's claimed that Alexander the Great invented the decary, so this worship with 10 rowers per oar section, often interpreted as a 10-banked galley, but it's something slightly different in this sense, because as we'll see now, the banks were probably separated within the section as well, if anything for reasons of space and or because there were different oars that were split among the 10, right? So we think, in fact, 2, so in groups of 5, remains uncorroborated by contemporary sources, meaning that Pliny talks about, of course, like multiple centuries before, regarding the Magus' invention of this. We'll talk again about what Alexander and his generals were able to pull off also after Magus' death. However, there was surely something around this. The concept in and of itself is plausible, right? It would have not been out of the reach of the Macedons at that time, as 10 decaries formed a significant component of Antigonus I Monophthalmus' fleet around 306 BC. I recently made a video about Lysimachos, and we've seen there all the staggering military costs that the Diadochoi were able to exact from the parts of Alexander's empire at that point, having accumulated unprecedented wealth in the history of mankind. We're just, in fact, that is not even a generation after Alexander's departure. And so considering that the general cost and the fact that fleets could also be mounted up in a relatively quick time, absolutely the Magus would have not had a problem to conceive such types of ships that even if they were also around. That's a bit the problem with especially naval warfare, that is not overwhelmingly documented. Also, archaeologically speaking, we just rely on the same shipbuilding structure, etc., on some relative conjectures. But again, the designs were not unattainable. It was not much even a problem of creating that, rather, how cost-benefit effective and, worth it would have been, right? So Alexander wanted, before subjugating Arabia, to turn against Carthage, right? And obviously that would have required a great naval effort. By the way, mostly also not just the Macedons, but the Hellenic ports and shipbuilders would have basically taken under. So this, let's say, obvious diadochoi capacity to use a sizable amount, by the way, here we're in the hands of Decares, suggests a continuation of Alexander's, not necessarily his personal naval innovations, but what was essentially at that point opening as an availability, especially to emperors of that enormous power and more material capacity. This development parallels, by the way, Antigone's creation of the heptare, that is to say the so-called 7, so again 7 men per oar section, where a third oarsman was added at one level to a hexare. So there were all the levels, right, from the 3 to the 4 up to, and there are hypotheses and general ideas that this could have reached up to the 14th or something. Again, if you think about it, it's not even this enormous issue. You just have to bigger boat meme. The point is, what do you need this stuff for? Right? Only if you have a super fleet and you need basically to center again your force in some central core with a flagship protected by other large ones. Because there is this cliche deriving especially from the Battle of Salamis in general. The more maneuverable ship actually won, right? We have encountered this also in other circumstances. Think about the same Roman Liburni against the Celts of Armorica, the Veneti. We've made a video exactly on that, on both the Liburna and Caesar's fight with the Veneti ships. But again, that was a simple circumstances where the Gauls had this sort of taller and more robustly hulled ships to withstand the Atlantic currents for different purposes. And they were fine pieces of naval engineering, but just for that specific purpose. The Roman Liburna and the general concept behind galley warfare was much more sophisticated in terms of properly naval warfare. So in that case, it's not much the fact that the Liburna was simply more maneuverable, but that the Romans were more ingenious and capable of exploiting a certain Gallic defeat, as we will see now, just within the same generation of Caesar, at least later down the later Roman civil wars. Of course, the Romans would develop their monster ships in the Mediterranean. Just Caesar didn't have any major resource to simply build those ships in the Atlantic from Gaul itself to cope with those guys in the north. So it doesn't mean much, right? You can win with smaller, more maneuverable ships, but it's not that simply confers a definitive advantage. All right, it happened in history, but it's not the decisive factor. There's plenty of issues that show the other way around. I mean, it's just like, again, the Romans, they dominated the Mediterranean for centuries. It's not like the coastal populations of the Mediterranean, of the Black Sea, of the Red Sea didn't have, many smaller, more maneuverable ships, but they didn't have the means, the capacity, the power, the technology, all the background, civilizational background to cope with the Roman Navy in open waters. So this is particularly important to understand. We've seen it also for early Germanic ships, also against the Romans on the Rhine and in the North Sea. So as we know, in warfare, there aren't such predictable dichotomies, right? So you understand here the concept behind the decary. It added a fourth oarsman at one level to a novere, so a 9, increasing power and crew capacity. We will see also for our standard ship here from the civil war between Octavian and Antony, or the one, the clashes between the same Octavian and Sextus Pompeius that I, by the way, made a video on. I'm also planning to make a special about the Battle of Actium. At some point, we will also look at a bit better, if anything, the times and the meaning of the Battle of Actium. That is such a crucial one in the history of mankind. The aforementioned decaries in Antigonus Monophthalmus's fleet, like the Novares, were not deployed by Demetrius Poliorcetes at the Battle of Salamis in Cyprus in 306, and are absent from the recorded fleet of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, indicating their specialized or limited use. Right, you know, these are pretty famous. Diadochoi, or we intend Diadochoi as also not just necessarily the first generation, but say the other sort of post-Alexander Macedonian rulers. Demetrius Poliorcetes was famous for, in fact, he was nicknamed after his enormous experimentation in siege machinery. Right, and also in ships in other cases, with actually a very poor scarce result. Like, you know, he is the best example of this Hellenistic fixation for giantism, for hyper-technological sophistication that, however, does not actually get the things done. In fact, Poliorcetes, I mean, the stormer of cities, was intended as an insult because he hadn't managed much of that, right? But that's also, in fact, a very didactic example of how technology is the eternal illusion in warfare, just per se. Strategy comes first of everything, right? Like those people say, kids think about tactics, men think about logistics. Well, actually, tactics is even more important than logistics. I mean, logistics is not even a branch of the art of war. The so-called men do not even know that. And above tactics, there is obviously strategy, right? And if you don't understand what it means, like as if I were saying that logistics is not important, well, I don't know what to tell you. Study von Clausewitz and get your mind cleared, please. Besides, the Hellenistic naval tradition of decary was not over with the aforementioned names. Philip V of Macedon. So we're pretty late in Hellenistic warfare, as you know. Philip V of Macedon's flagship at the Battle of Chios in 201 BC was a decary, underscoring its prestige as a command vessel, proving a general habit. Also, we often don't know how many kinds of ships existed, or sort of classes we could anachronistically say of ships were employed, say, in all Hellenistic naval warfare. That, again, it was fairly intense for the times and the places, but also relatively rare, as I was saying before, just like for the entire antiquity. Again, we are spoiled by the beautiful narratives of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides, by Xenophon, etc. But if we're not talking about the Persian wars before, but again, especially in the former case, we're looking at smaller naval engagements. I made multiple videos about it, mostly with the pretty standard trireme at that point. We made lots of videos on those naval battles of the Peloponnesian War that are quite illustrative, but they are also, in this sense, like sort of quite exemplificative in the fact that they are fairly composed clashes. There is enough variety exactly because they're relatively contained, small engagement, or not even too small, but definitely not the ones we see, for example, among the Diadochoi, that notoriously are much less documented, paradoxically. Even though their warfare was more advanced, there wasn't in Hellenistic culture that sort of, you could say, middle estate that could simply describe things as, you know, participating to magistracies, to battles themselves, etc. No, there was a monarchy. The phalanges were sort of some sort of proletarians, etc. So it's a completely different picture. It's a bit the same for Rome. You know that, you know, if it wasn't for Polybius, for example, we would not know that much precisely about, I don't know, most of Roman Middle Republican warfare, right? And also in the later periods, also early imperial warfare, we've seen it in many videos about the Romans. We do not know too much. I mean, sure, Rome was huge. We have plenty of stuff, but exactly by that scale, like overall, this is aligned with classical history average. Again, not everything is sort of 5th century Spartan Athens, the latter especially. So we don't know too much, right? We've seen this also for example, about the famous corvus that people, of course, like have come to see even as some sort of, if not of imaginary military instrument in naval combat, at least something that, we can think was not really that impacting in the overall picture. The Romans at some point, especially in the later Republic, beginning to write more intensely and under the influence of Hellenic historiography, they began to sort of write in a fashion that while still uniquely Roman, was also not just influenced in a more intellectual sense by the Greeks, but that was meant properly to show the Hellenic world, how the Romans had sort of at some point topped Hellenic stuff, had improved them. That's what the concept that the Romans liked very much, at least in the moment in which they could say to the Greeks. Among each other, they didn't care because they were much more traditionally primitive in some way. But this idea, again, that the Romans, in that case, like would have the technology that managed to defeat, for example, the Carthaginians, is some sort of Hellenistic bias, all right? For the rest, again, they didn't even talk too much about technology to begin with. And when we get to the later Republic, the civil wars year, especially in the second half of the first century BC, we don't have, again, even for this period, an overwhelming amount of information about the strictly military details of all this. What we're looking at today, is, at least as a prototype, you know that for this series about the various warships of antiquity and at least the first part of the Middle Ages, we pick some sort of standard and or at least like specific type of ship in a peculiar context, etc. So for today, I wanted to conceptualize a little bit the decary of the Battle of Actium from Mark Antony's side. Let's put it in this way. Let's pass from the side of the enemy. Made lots of videos about Octavian, Augustus. I will keep, again, making videos about this critical juncture. But it's an interesting scenario because, as you know, Antony was using, well, actually a lot of Roman military, but also could afford the astronomic financial support of the Ptolemaic kingdom, run by, at least, namely by Cleopatra, that actually had much to say. The sources tell us this, which was odd for a woman that, remember, was always ruling on behalf of some male relative, right? That she had married herself, because, of course, there couldn't be in the Iudocoi kingdom, in an Indo-European situation and beyond, like a woman in charge. It's completely alien to this era. But still, she was an incredibly capable governor, and she cared very much, especially about her kingdom. And before Actium, naturally, she invested as much as possible in Antony's faith. And when you look at this, in this sense, Hellenistic fleet, even though Mark Antony was not really the Hellenist that had betrayed Rome, we can admit that Octavian's propaganda was quite effective, and chapeau to him for that. They were doing the same from on the other side. In any case, you would see a lot of Hellenistic influence in these ships to begin with. First of all, because, as we've seen, they had been created first by the Macedonians, because the Romans had basically adopted them without changing what was already essentially running. And also, again, things wouldn't change too much with the Romans themselves. I mean, the fundamental galley technology and the size of the ships in this moment was functional for both involved. It was mostly about Rome getting to the level of power that could afford to wield these ships. And because, again, some of these ships were actually Macedonian and or made in the Levantine ports by the Ptolemies for the Romans. All right. Now, Plutarch notes that Mark Antony commanded numerous decaries at Ephesus in Asia Minor in 32 BC. During the preparations for the same Actium campaign. It was a colossal effort. So all these eastern coastal centers were squeezed. I mean, Ephesus was one of the great Hellenistic capitals, as you know, or at least cities, like mostly famous because of the temple of Artemis. Cassius Dio is a source for the same information as well. We've seen just the other day in the video about the Battle of Pharsalis that, Cassius Dio used Plutarch as a source as well, and also in a sometimes properly extensive literary sense. He records that decaries in Antony's fleet for the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, though Florus, that is a later and somehow less reliable source, suggests that Antony's largest ships were noveres, right? This is obviously like Cassius Dio, Roman History 50:23, Plutarch, Life of Antony 61, and Florus Epitome 2:21. No direct evidence details the ore system or performance metrics of the decaries. However, again, we're capable of suggesting that these ships likely employed a multi-level rowing arrangement, possibly with 3 banks of oars even, each manned by multiple rowers, right? So staggered in depth mostly. So if we would have been even less than, 2 per 5, right? We think up to 4 per oar in the upper banks to achieve necessary propulsion for their massive size that we will detail later. This configuration, while powerful, of course contributed to the decaries' reported clumsiness and immobility, as historical sources describe Antony's ships at Actium. And when we look at this, as we were saying before, it's not like, again, having the bigger ships per se is wrong. It depends on what kind of tactic and sort of even strategy you're pursuing. Besides, it all depends on the quality of leadership of the crews, of the wind, the position on the coastline that was really critical. In fact, that's what, from the other side, Agrippa was trying to counter in ways to avoid that full, powerful smashing capacity. But even these bigger ships, Octavian would have had some overall, like also some big ships of the bigger types on his own, mostly relying on lighter, mostly Liburnite, that, as we've seen, is also a generic term. Some of these ships were pretty sizable. In any case, on average, smaller than these monsters of the sea, that, however, still really had a substantial maneuverability. They weren't just there sort of taking hits, like floating platforms and nothing else. Even though the actual function of these ships at large in the Art of War era did get down to that, right? Most of this warfare was very similar in a sense to land battles, where you had basically these lines of ships locking into one another, and then the troops boarding while bombarding each other, etc. So, say, maneuverability in some ways was limited, and it was rather the Marines on decks were massacring one another. And again, some broader, maneuvers were important to some degree, but at large, like, there was much else piling up to arrive to that 50% plus 1 in relative terms to the enemy to actually make it. Orosius notes that in his Historia versus Paganus 6:19, so again, this is also an even later source, that the decks of Antony's ships, including noveres and decaries, stood 10 Roman feet. So this is basically 3 meters above the water, right? So this did reflect their towering structure designed for the aforementioned boarding and missile combat, but it's not even this immense thing. It is really immense for the times, but as you understand here, not much because of the size per se, but for the concentration, because at that level, like, any increase would sort of be escalatorily daring in terms of actual, again, cost-benefit, right? They could build ships, that maybe were even 5 times bigger, right? But was it really possible to put them at sea for fighting? No, and that's why we don't see them, right? Here we're looking at the bigger sizes that are actually fitting for combat and require extraordinary capacities to handle. These are also unique pieces. Just think of how non-really standardized these really were. Not even the final rank, Liburna, or back in the day, the triremes, had really been fully standardized. They were actually, yes, quite compressedly uniform in many ways, but especially in this case, the bigger the ship, the more unique, the more spirited, with some ghost on its own. Like, as you know, the genius in Roman religion would have been attached to them as well. We will talk about that later, because there is all a spiritual dimension nobody talks about next to the technical one. Now, the decary's size and weight, compounded by heavy armaments like ballistae and other types of catapults, made them vulnerable to the more agile Liburnians in quinqueremes that were instead the numerical bulk of Octavian's fleet. Again, we will see this better in other videos. I already made a video about the Liburni. We haven't talked about the quinqueremes yet. However, it's said in this context that the arpax was used. This is around, in fact, this age of Roman partition of the Mediterranean during the civil wars, and we have this naval clash in which the arpax, a grappling device fired from ballistae, was used basically to restrain, in a sense, and for the purpose of boarding the larger vessels. This is at least what Cassius Dio in his Roman History 5031 says. And as I said before, this can be the case, just like when Caesar's Liburni cut the rigs of the Gallic ships, etc. Only if and when, like in that case, for example, it was a favorable lack of wind, rather, that made it easier for the Roman galleys, right? So there are different circumstances where you can use this stuff, and obviously surrounding an enemy and, say, assaulting him from multiple sides, especially if this ship is like 3 meters tall above water, is of course something you want to do. But it's not the arpax per se is making that, nor you can even use that for that purpose if you haven't already achieved some kind of local superiority over this ship, mostly by, say, numbers. Right. By the way, also on the ship's decks, you could fight to the death or also surrender at some point. Antony's decaries at Actium were likely equipped with such artillery themselves, which is also another thing to take in consideration. Why wouldn't, in fact, the bigger ships use the same exact weapons in that way? In fact, you need to, even mounting catapults was, like, for the smaller ships, sort of more demanding in relative terms, giving the quite equilibrated stability of the ships, especially for the sake of maneuvering, at least in the phase of ramming, that required an incredibly sophisticated training, including the Marines on deck to literally being able to move across the same surface to maximize, for example, the impact's effectiveness to the enemy ship. So something we have unfortunately lost in terms of literal, manual or just wisdom, but that were incredibly skilled at. I probably would be amazed at the competence and the ease, right, by these Marines, the capacity of carrying that out. Besides, I would like to point out one thing. This may not pertain exactly to the decaries, but as far as sort of the broader range of engagements that would have occurred in classical war, don't think that this was different from the Middle Ages, right? In the Middle Ages, we start having chronicles that tell really every single skirmish or raid. In the classical treatises, nobody really cared about this, but they were there as well. And this is valid also for naval warfare. So there was probably much greater naval practice than we see, and these bigger engagements were rather the culmination of them, like the big pitched battles that sort of everybody remembers, as opposed to the skirmishers that sometimes we even know were there, but nobody really even mentions them ever, and so they simply pass to the foreground to a degree that nobody really recalls, and so this informs the way we study military history, sometimes in fact in quite incomplete and non-diachronic, non-comparative fashion, right? Indeed, Agrippa's tactics were successfully exploiting the limited maneuverability of the decaries from Antony's side. And this again, entailed, for example, prioritizing ramming ores and boarding with smaller, faster ships, of course. However, the broader strategy that would bring Octavian to victory, as you know, is something more comprehensive, in fact, as always. Not, yes, the clash between the ships was important, and it was necessary at the same time. But of course, there is a broader preponderation of factors that is skillfully exploited by leadership in ways that, in fact, are conducive to a very specific outcome. Again, we will see that battle in particular, hopefully soon. And so let's pass to our decaris here, named Antonia, right after Mark Antony the Gens. I made multiple videos about Mark Antony. That is an incredibly, if not complex, but probably misunderstood figure. I may be partisan in Octavian's favor, but I really find Antony's figure probably very much damned by defeat for obvious reasons, and obviously deserved one, following the same traditional theology followed by the Romans, but again, mostly in the characterization. This is something I like very much to do as a historian, trying to understand the man behind the historical mask, if we can even speak of such persona. Meaning, what do we actually know about him? This is not obviously a video we'll talk about Antony, but there is some sort of, legacy in this figure stemming from the same Caesar. Octavian surpassed Caesar, right? Caesar theologically allows Octavian to do what he does, but in political terms, like Mark Antony, far from being, as I was saying before, like the degenerated Philo-Hellenist, whatever, was actually a stout Roman, and very Caesarian in that mentality. In fact, Octavian surpassed in his genius by fulfilling what had been the same Kaiser's, universal mission, right? And this, it makes it all the more interesting in many ways. Antonia is Cleopatra's flagship at the Battle of Actium, and it exemplifies the largest warships deployed during the Roman civil wars of the 1st century BC. It's such a majestic ship, as you can see here. These decaries featured, as we explained, 2 rows of oars positioned nearly at the same level, with 10 rowers arranged in a 5+5 configuration per section. At least we want to think that the Antonia worked like that. We have no idea, but here we have to explain it. How could it have been? It would have been like that, right? So imagine, again, 5 guys. There are actually 2 oars for the same section, the same level, and they're staggered, right? And also they're staggered say along across the same section, meaning that, or in depth of the same section. So 5 guys are closer to the oar port, so to say, and the others are more within, because there must be enough room for each other at that point, and having the same amount of propulsion power, but squeezed into this space that obviously allows for more oars, more oars to operate, right? And these oars are a marvel to behold, right? They're exceptional in length, necessary to propel the massive hull, requiring some rowers to stand during the stroke to maintain leverage even, right? The rowers were, at this point in history, as also mostly throughout the Middle Ages as well, actually salaried, right? It depends on who they were, telling the truth, but it's not like, I don't know, during, for example, the Turkish wars where in the Mediterranean there were so many slaves, and normally they were used in that fashion. Oars are so crucial. They have to be quite fit, well fed, right? They must take specific poses. They have to be top, especially in this climatic actions. So imagine the physicality of the guy at the end of the oar. The guy who was using his entire physicality standing, right, by maintaining the leverage of this war. This is incredibly important because imagine all of this must be coordinated, right? The oars are not just trained, of course, to maneuver the ship according to the orders, but they must maintain in that a perfect cohesion. Otherwise, you simply lose energy, right? It goes in different directions. It's not functional for the naval maneuvers. The aforementioned rowers arrangement maximize trust. In other words, if you had to destroy everything floating, on the Mediterranean waves, you just had to make this massive push with, as we will see now, this incredibly heavy ship that would literally smash into everything in front of you, right? And obviously, in order to do that, you need a great deal of momentum, a great deal of maneuver, and a great deal of effort for the same rower. So it's really intense, right? Likely exacerbating the ship's sluggish handling itself, as noted by, we were pointing out before, Cassius Dio, who describes Antony's fleet as cumbrous and slow. So it's Cassius Dio 5015. And designed primarily for boarding tactics, so pouring on the enemy decks a hell of a lot of Marines, because of the size, of course, of the ship that could contain them, the Antonia flagship and similar decaries were equipped with dart throwers, like the Oxybulas or smaller ballistae. I made a video about Roman artillery, one of the earliest videos of Schwerpunkt. We'll come back on this stuff. You shouldn't overrate catapults in general, not even in naval warfare. Of course, they helped, especially from a psychological point of view, to already, I don't know, like imagine a stone bolt throw, reducing a legionnaire's head to pulp, right? That wouldn't particularly help, like the mood of the guy next to him who had his brain or splatter over his face. We can think, of course, of larger torsion-powered artillery of some even more constructed fashion. Naturally, the bigger the artillery, the more of a problem for the ship's barycenter really was. The important was, if anything, to support missile barrages before boarding. So to maximize, again, the shock effect. That was the actual point. And naturally, most of the shock would come from the Marines themselves. And that's why, again, they wouldn't simply overload their ships with catapults, but rather with these guys. But the balance was all calculated in that functional, for that functional dynamic. The ship featured collapsible towers positioned at the bow and stern to protect key boarding points. This aspect is fascinating because you know that also just trees were normally pulled down, also in other times in warfare. So any superstructure over the deck was normally dismantleable, depending on the circumstances. In any case, this specific towers did help, like preventing some kind of boarding, which, by the way, considering how big the ship was, it was difficult to do. And that's why, as we've seen, they tried to harpoon these ships to eventually, from different sides and overwhelming them with numbers. So reducing the enemy, the decary's advantage in height by, having different legionnaires sort of mounting the ship, even from below, from a disadvantaged position, but still, again, in sufficient numbers to overwhelm resistance, and or at least to have a fight, a more or less balanced fight at that point. Given that the towers were situated exactly at the normally, again, at the ends of the ship, normally that were the preferential boarding areas, they had an they weren't just there to hamper the enemy boarding, but all by simply staying in a way, but of course serving as shooting points, right? They were angled at 45 degrees to the ship's longitudinal axis to face anticipated attack vectors. So imagine guys, again, on top of these with catapults, with pila, with bows, slings, etc. These towers could be jettisoned to lighten the ship during retreat, by the way, which is something quite fitting here from Antony and Cleopatra's side at the Battle of Actium. This is also important. Again, if you have to row away to save your skin, you have to get as light as possible. And these designs were a hallmark of the broader Hellenistic naval once adopted by the Romans for close quarters combat, which, again, would have been practiced by the Macedons as well, except for the fact that the Romans were a bit more sort of aggressively primitive and had really a great taste for bloodshed in a very orderly, disciplined fashion, but also still in a very individually primitive and warrior-like way. In the fleets of Octavian and Sextus Pompeius, again, I made a video about exactly this. If you are interested, you can check that out. Such towers were uniformly colored to distinguish allied ships. Right? Imagine you see this ship, the towers, also as we'll see now, the sides of the ships, everything was colored at this point, including the legionnaires aside from the faces. There's hardly anything more colorful than such as military scenarios. So the tower, being big and elevated, by being colored, would simply signal whose ship was that. Probably more complex ways than we imagined, because again, these ships were, in a sense, uniformly colored. Just to say again, there is a dominant color that identifies a certain size, but in many ways, like certain commanders, certain units, etc., would be so famous even for the enemy that there would be some sort of proto-heraldic direction in the way they were painted, right? And everything was immediately recognizable. This was very important, especially as small the ship was, paradoxically. In fact, the bigger ship would have been recognized in ways that were, say, unmistakable, including, again, the size of these monsters here. As we've seen, there were multiple of them, but let's say, in this case, I don't know, Antony and Cleopatra would have built them in ways that only in the East, would have been made to an extent, right? It's rather the smaller ship that maybe wants to be more uniform because it has to be recognized more quickly. Or maybe it doesn't want to be recognized if it is going to sneak across the enemy line, so to say, even though, again, it doesn't quite work like that, especially if it can't do that. It's so small that it's not even, warship in practice. So you understand how everything is actually very well balanced, how odds are always balanced in warfare, and how there is a gold standard, good enough, so to say, in warfare that makes the thing done, right? So these would be all practical measures in the chaotic melee of naval engagements. Appian, in his civil wars, that again we cited just the other day in the video about Pharsalus, 105 in this case, is the one telling us about the different colors of the ships. The Antonia's figurehead was a crocodile, symbolizing Egypt, suggesting, of course, its Ptolemaic origin under Cleopatra's command. So this obviously had a pretty natural symbolism with that, but it tells you how ingrained even just the local symbolism, the local sense of belonging actually was. The ship in and of itself was considered like a sea creature of some kind. Imagine like Octavian's Liburna as a bit like in the Lohengrin tradition, like the Night of the Swan, this predatory eagles like falling from the north towards the vulnerable feminine south that is seized and gravitated. The Nile just representing like female reproductive organs, and the Roman eagle really seizing, and the same as Octavian lands and also takes out Cleopatra at that point. It's such a dramatic moment. There is all a sense of Alexandrine legacy. I mean, Alexander was buried in Alexandria, and Octavian will open his tomb to look at him. At least it was exposed to begin with, as you know. But he wanted to really see him from close, and he thought that Alexander was alive, obviously, for obvious reasons. I'm not even going to explain why that is the case. So imagine the meaning behind it. And there are, how often, for example, you have seen the swan as a symbol. According to you, what that was? Well, exactly that same Indo-European symbolism that eventually you find in the Arthurian tradition as well. The Romans had it identical to the Rhone, also just talking about the meaning of the similarities between the Celts and the Italics for that matter. And the Capitoline geese were exactly understood as that, because these birds were, cyclically migrating, lost in heaven for half of the year and coming back, and so bringing that divine wisdom and sixth sense, etc. So without digressing too much, imagine this a wide array of symbolism. Again, there were many, right? As you know, the same Roman eagle at some point, roughly around Marian form, was not yet the standardized symbol. It was just the preeminent one in the Indo-European tradition, but there were others, horses, snakes. Here we have the crocodile, for example. And this was a symbol, indeed, of chthonic power, that same Egyptian feminine south that we were talking about before. It was not less dangerous. And in fact, like the same Cleopatra's aspis that mirrors that Pelasgian regeneration of the self through death and swallowing and venom and this terrifying mortality, literally terrestrial as terrifying mortality from terra, in Latin it means to make, to become earth, dirt at the same time. So it's really that powerful against the Apollonian Roman solar symbolism. By the way, another thing that Octavian did when he went to Egypt, to explain that in the video about the Persian cavalry horse, was bringing back from there to Rome some magnificent exemplar of Nisaean horses, right? Of the Fergana, like the heavenly horses of the great Indo-European tradition. Now, the vexillum was per se fixed flag, like marking the Roman flagship, right? It would remain hosted day and night, because in times of possible emergency, the flagship had always to be there, even when the admiral was actually not on board, right? But still, of course, the admiral would have not been that far away, but that's exactly the point. It was awaiting for him, also in a broader in terms of imperial vessel, literally, like in this case. When two admirals met at sea, the junior would lower their vexillum in, unfortunately, a poorly documented but still substantial naval ceremonial, indicating deference. It's beautiful if you think about that. It reflects that, again, a rigid, hierarchical understanding of authority in the rooted and, again, bloody Roman mentality. Additionally, when a Roman magistrate took to sea, their chief lictor stood at the bow holding the fasces, so mirroring terrestrial protocols and reinforcing Roman authority. We talk about the Roman fasces, the fascist symbology of the Lictorian axe, the Indo-European war axe for that matter, that symbolized cohesion, unity, and again, in fact, that compaction of the world that, in this sense, also the Actium was achieved with Octavian taking over the entire world in the process, putting an end to the civil war, putting an end to the spell of that break that had occurred between the God's chosen people, with the great sacrilege of having spilled the secrets of the Sibylline texts and having brought to equally like to the spilling of blood of God's chosen people. These ships would be the vessels of the same. So imagine what kind of metaphysical concepts behind such an enormous naval battle like the one of Actium by ancient standards really would have existed increasingly loading the symbol of the ships in their identity, their name. They have obviously all a name. This we know also as for artillery at some point, especially for these bigger ships, telling the truth. And so all their decorations, their symbolism, and more are incredibly meaningful and pertinent to the whole enterprise. The source for the Lictorian Acts is Livy 29:14. This tells you, again, how important it was for the Romans to display their own imperial power and unitary concept of world domination through any vessel, on any vessel through which the imperium was carried. Right, so this is incredibly important, incredibly Roman, and bad blip as blip. And again, you understand also in many ways why the Romans took over this. Even though, again, traditionally this happened more or less in any other culture, it's just us that don't care about it anymore. So were we to approximate some decorous specifications in terms of size, right, and considering what this could really be about. So the length of a decorous could be over 45 meters in this case. So we're talking the Antonia here. Then again, we don't have the exact measures in general, but considering reconstructions, etc., we'll talk about this now. It's likely that we're talking this 45 meters in length, over 12 meters beam over outrigger, and almost 10 meters the hull. A draft of almost 2 meters. A crew of 600 rowers. We can conceive other 40 sailors and support personnel, and 400 marines. So this is a hell of a massive ship. Now, do you understand how packed these troops would be? Because 45 meters is a lot, right? But stuffing people into it, it's something else. Again, it is quite spacious, but you really want to achieve that superiority by literally stuffing the deck with marines. And again, having this immense propulsive capacity, not just for moving the ship with marines on it, but also, again, for having that effective. Imagine this mass moving at speed and literally fracturing everything in between. It's really interesting and important. Now, recent studies highlight that the decary's design prioritize overwhelming force over speed accordingly, with their high decks and heavy armaments making them formidable, but in this sense, like a bit just devoted to that without much variation on the theme. Again, they would be maneuverable to an extent, but not as much as, for example, Agrippa's forces at Actium, where some broader tactics at some point may have been experimented in an innovative direction. Again, not for much other naval warfare after this, because it settled the matter that was the actual military instrument for the political goal at hand of Octavian. By the way, again, we don't know too much about the war. We will discuss this in another video. We'll make something way more in-depth about the Battle of Actium itself through the sources, as we do for the other videos, and some other general reflections on the entire political, strategical, cultural context of it all. Think at ultra-heavy cavalry on the field. But I mean ultra-heavy cavalry, not, like the Macedonian Etairoi, but literally, the Seleucid cataphracts. Imagine that, like an overwhelmingly, crushingly expensive unit that objectively can basically smash everything in the way, as also part of the Roman troops found out the hard way at the Battle of Magnesia, that in any case was in fact lost by the Seleucids. And that, however, require also an important apparatus in or support troops and some viable sort of opportunity to exploit their potential. If you don't have like a clear, like in this case for the decaries, a stretch of water where you can make them pass, where you can also support them with smaller ships going along them, and against enemies that are going to be standing simply there getting smashed. And again, the deckers didn't. I'm of course hyperbolically describing this, like there would be ways to smash the deckers also with some large ships, because again, we're of all levels. This was the 10, and there were, again, as we've seen, the 9, the 8, the 7, the 6, etc. But again, also from the other side, that required an enormous cost. And as we've seen, it's not like the entire fleet were constituted by this ship. So in general, you get the gist of how calibrated and how very sophisticatedly calibrated these forces really were. Because again, you can't use this ship without that specific purpose, right? You can't just throw it in the melee in some random way. You have to carefully contemplate how you can use that in the battle line against which enemy, etc. We see that again, some of these ships could be outmaneuvered when cut off from the rest, where things were getting worse. Hence the Arpax, in a sense, and the possibility of smaller ships. Even though we know a few about the Arpax itself and its actual effectiveness, it's a bit like the Corvus, this kind of special weapons that at the end of the day did not make the battle itself. Nevertheless, imagine, we mentioned logistics at the beginning, like also again to field to put at sea these ships in the first place, relying on large crews, essentially over 1,000 men between rowers, marines, general crew. This was crushing in terms of logistical costs. Again, Cleopatra invested basically all her kingdom's fortune in the expedition. That's also why she actually pulled out of the battle with the Antonia, as you know, leaving Antony. He would make it back to Egypt, but abandoning him in this crucial moment, stripping him of that kind of imperial symbolism itself as a sort of betrayal, and that in fact the destiny of the lower feminine controlled more degenerated south that the Romans were to redeem, not to be dependent on, like in the case of Antony. Again, being harsh on Antony, but we will see what he was doing actually in order to get to that defeat. To begin with, this was an exceptional effort. It speaks volumes, of course, of the material, of the organizational capacity from both sides at Actium, of course, but impressively from an Eastern standpoint, that was still Roman ruled practically. Agrippa's blockade disrupted provisions. Appian 5:118 in Civil Wars tells us about this. So again, there are lots of different factors you can consider at this point, however, beyond any other sort of tactical circumstance, not just of Actium, but in general of the scope of today's video, that mostly sticks to the actual ship per se as a unit. This is a military historical unit video. We will at some point make naval units sort of playlist kind of stuff. So again, it's important really to talk about these topics because they show you how complicated, even reconstructing at some point the topic itself, the ship itself can be, but how we kind of know about it, and how we can sort of understand also the rest of naval warfare to some extent through certain features, certain characteristics of the ship itself, right? Even down to theological symbolism, etc., right? It's interesting, again, to discuss this all. If anything, however, these videos stop a bit to the technical side as well. I make them because they make everything in turn complete, right? For the sake of completion, of encyclopedical ambition, so to say, but really also helping a bit the understanding of the more technical side of the story. In Schwerpunkt, sometimes I think that even though we often talk tactics and its brutality. We stick often to the moral dimension, which is perfectly fine, but surely insisting on its definitive prevalence. However, at some point needing really also to give the basic of the actual technical material evidence as well, because you can't just do without it. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.